The first thing Sergeant Dara O.C. noticed about the creature was that it was crying. It sat at the far end of the quarantine bay, curled into itself like a child embarrassed by a wound, and the sounds coming from it were unmistakably grief, high, thin, oscillating at a frequency that made the fillings in her back teeth ache. It was roughly the size of a large dog, covered in pale violet fur matted with something dark around one shoulder, and its eyes, when it lifted its head and caught hers through the reinforced glass, were amber. Amber and wet and entirely, uncomfortably aware. Dara had been in the 9th Xenological Response Unit for 4 years. She had seen things that broke lesser soldiers in ways you couldn't put in an official report. She had once watched a Vorath harvester, the size of a city block, fold itself into the sky above Stuttgart. She had held her breath in a drainage tunnel for 6 hours while a Keth scout ran its sensory organs along the concrete above her head. She had learned to control her fear so completely that it was less like courage and more like a kind of practiced numbness. But the crying got to her. Crying always got to her. She pressed her palm to the glass. The creature stopped making the sound. It watched her hand. "I know," she said. "I know." Behind her, Lieutenant Harlan Voss cleared his throat in the particular way that meant he was about to say something she wasn't going to. He was a good officer in most respects, careful and precise, but he had a habit of treating her moments of human instinct as tactical errors. "Sergeant, the debrief is in 10. I'm aware. Command wants a preliminary assessment of Compact 1. Whether it's worth the diplomatic risk to." "It was crying, Harlan." A pause. "Yes. Before I came in over the comms, I heard it through the feed. It's been crying for 6 hours." She dropped her hand. The creature tracked the motion. Whatever they did to it in that distortion field, whatever the collective pumped into its biology, it remembers who it was before. It's morning. Voss was quiet for longer than usual. That was how she knew she'd said something that landed. "The debrief," he said at last, more gently. "The debrief," she agreed. The official name for the compact was a designation string that no human mouth was built to produce, so Command had settled on calling them the Collective, and the Collective had, insofar as anyone could tell, settled on calling humans something that the xenolinguists translated approximately as the ones who refused to stop. It was not entirely clear whether this was an insult or a statement of baffled fact. The general consensus in the 9th was that it was probably both. They had arrived 11 years ago, slipping through a fold in the upper thermosphere over the North Sea. For the first 72 hours, the prevailing human assumption was that this was first contact, that the moment of reaching would finally be mutual, that something ancient and luminous had come to meet us. Then the collective began feeding the distortion to the animals. Not all animals, not randomly. The infection, that was the word the scientists settled on, though it was more like an override, a rewrite. Targeted creatures with certain neural complexity thresholds, bonding to their limbic architecture and reshaping them from the inside. Affected animals became something else, not mindless, worse than mindless. They became instruments, precise, directed, catastrophically effective instruments deployed against human infrastructure, human populations, human morale. A wolf pack brought down a power grid in Manitoba. A pod of orcas gutted the underwater sensor array that protected the eastern seaboard. And then, in Odaiba, in the 3rd year of the incursion, something far worse. A creature the size of a transit bus, built on the architecture of a tiger, formed by the collective's infection into something that walked on its hind legs and burned with cold blue light, tore through an evacuation corridor, and killed 47 people in 11 minutes. That was when Command decided that simply fighting the infected was not enough. They needed to understand the infection, which meant they needed a subject who was infected and recoverable. Compact 1, the crying creature in Quarantine Bay 7, was the closest they had managed in 4 years of trying. Her name, as best anyone could transliterate it, was Sola. This was discovered not through linguistic analysis, but through something simpler. Dara brought a data pad into the observation corridor, loaded the creature's vocal signature into a translation framework that was, charitably, still theoretical, and asked, directly, in a voice she used for exactly 2 things, wounded soldiers and cornered animals, "What do you want me to call you?" The creature made a sound. The framework caught it. The screen read, Sola. I am called Sola. Dara sat down on the corridor floor, her back against the glass. She heard behind her a soft sound as Sola also sat, back to back, separated by 8 centimeters of reinforced polymer. My name's Dara. Dara. A pause. You are the one who put your hand on the glass. Yes. Why? Because you were sad, and I didn't have anything better to offer. A long silence, the ventilation cycled. Somewhere in the facility above them, someone was running in boots. The particular rhythm of urgency that never quite left a military installation. I remember, Sola said, what I was before. I remember it the way you might remember a house you lived in as a child, the shape of things, the warmth. I cannot go back to it, but I remember. Dara was quiet then. What were you? I was someone's. A beat. Shoe, and they were mine. The conflict that nearly tore the Ninth apart in those weeks had nothing to do with the collective, and everything to do with the disagreement that had been building for 8 months between its 2 most effective field operators. On one side, Sergeant Dara Ose, whose read on the Sola situation was that they had, for the first time, a living bridge to the collective's infection methodology, something that had survived the override, retained coherent memory, and was, against all expectation, communicating. Dara believed that learning to communicate back, deeply, patiently, was worth more than any tactical strike package command had authorized in 4 years. On the other side, Warrant Officer Jin Reyes, whose read on the Sola situation was that a partially infected organism of unknown stability was a biological and strategic liability, that the Ninth was a combat unit, not a therapy clinic, and that the resources being poured into Dara's rooftop conversations with an alien animal were resources not being pointed at the 17 active distortion zones currently destabilizing East Asia. They had this argument in every register available to 2 people who had also, for approximately 14 months, been the most important person in each other's life. They had it formally in briefings. They had it in the mess over cold food. They had it at 0200 in a hallway outside the quarantine bay, when neither of them could sleep. Voices low, both of them aware that Solas could probably hear them through the glass. You're not wrong, Dara said, which was how she usually started when she knew she was going to hold her ground anyway. About the resource question, you're not wrong. But she's the first one that came back, Jin. The first one that retained herself through the infection. And we don't know what that means yet. Could mean she's still infected. That she's a vector. That everything she's telling you is exactly what the collective wants her to tell you. Could mean that. Dara leaned against the wall. It could also mean that some part of whatever they do to these animals doesn't take. That there's something in there that pushes back. That the infection isn't absolute. She looked at him. If that's true, if it's not absolute, then we have a way in. Jin was quiet for a long time. He rubbed the back of his neck, which was something he did when he was losing an argument he didn't want to admit he was losing. You're going to keep doing this, he said. Yes, even if command orders you to stop. Command ordered us to understand the infection. This is the best shot at that we've had since year 1. He looked at her for a moment in the low blue light of the corridor. Then he said quietly, don't get attached. Too late, she said. He almost smiled. Almost, I know. The school in the life Dara barely remembered having used to hold a harvest festival every autumn. Mother had done the sewing for the cafe uniforms. 2 years running. Dara remembered the machine running through the nights. Mother humming something low and old that she could never quite identify. After the smell of cut fabric and the rattle of the bobbin, she would bring Dara a glass of water at midnight and press her hand to Dara's forehead and say, "You're not sick, you're just awake." And they would sit together listening to the machine. She thought about this, inexplicably. Shh. The morning Sola told her about the collective's name for the infection. Shh. They call it the shaping. Sola said. It is not. They do not think of it as a weapon. They think of it as a kindness. They believe that complexity without direction is waste. They shape the complex things toward purpose. They're converting animals into weapons and calling it a kindness. They believe that a purpose-filled existence is superior to a purposeless one. They do not have the concept of a pause, the framework processing, chosen relation, the bond between a self and another self that is freely given and freely held. It does not exist in their architecture. They cannot compute it. When they observe it in other species, they classify it as another pause, interference, a distortion in the data. Dora sat very still. They're eradicating bonded species, she said slowly, not because they want to conquer, because they literally cannot understand why a creature would choose another creature over function. Yes. And the infection, the shaping, it severs the bond. That's the mechanism. Yes. Sola's voice through the translator was flat, careful. When they shaped me, I could feel it happening. The part of me that knew. A long pause. Feel it being cut away. But it did not finish. Something resisted. What? I do not know. I only know that there was still something left after. Something they could not reach. Dara pressed her hand to the glass again. This time she felt, very faintly, through 8 centimeters of reinforced polymer, a warmth on the other side. Jin came to find her that evening. He looked like a man who had been having an argument with himself for several hours and had finally reluctantly come down on the side he didn't want to be on. Dora knew this look. She loved it slightly, because it always meant he was about to do something honest. Mimi flagged an anomaly in the Sector 4 sensor array, he said. Mimi was the 9th's intelligence analyst, 24 years old, relentlessly competent, possessed of a deep conviction that the universe owed her honesty in return for hers. Distortion signatures converging on grid reference 47. The collective is moving something big. How big? The signatures match the harvester class that hit Odaiba in year 3. Dara was quiet for a moment. Imperial class? Yes. He sat down beside her, not quite touching. And command wants the 9th on point for intercept. Which means you and I need to be in the field in 6 hours, not sitting on the floor outside a quarantine bay. I know. I know you know. He looked at the floor. She told you something today. Mimi said you were in there for 4 hours. She told me the mechanism. Why the infection works the way it does, what it's targeting. Dara was quiet for a moment. Jin. They're going after bonded species because they can't understand bonding. The shaping severs the neural connection between a creature and whoever it's chosen. That's the whole architecture. Sever the bond, purpose the creature. She looked at him. But Sola's bond didn't sever something in the biology held. He was very still, which means, she continued, that the infection has a vulnerability. A thing it can't override. We just don't know yet what it is. She glanced at the glass. We might if I had more time. You have 6 hours, he said, not unkindly. Then I'll use 6 hours. He stood up, paused. She could see him working through something. The same way he worked through a tactical problem. Quietly, completely, leaving nothing unexamined. I'll get us the intercept route, he said. You get what you can from her. A beat. And Dara, if anything she's told you gives us something we can use in the field tonight. Tell me, however it sounds. Tell me. I will. He left. She turned back to the glass. He is afraid for you. Sola said. Yes. That is the thing they cannot compute. A pause. It is also, I think, the thing I had left, after the shaping, the thing they could not reach. Dara looked at her hands. Fear? No. Sola said. Fear is only the shape of it. The thing underneath. The thing that makes the fear matter. The distortion opened over the bay at 0340 right on schedule. Imperial-class Vorith harvesters were, in the clinical language of the 9th's operational briefings, collective converted megafauna of aquatic origin, heavily restructured for aerial deployment, roughly analogous to a dragon in the human mythological sense, except that the comparison failed immediately because no dragon in any human story had ever torn through the electromagnetic spectrum across 6 simultaneous frequencies, while projecting a localized distortion field that destabilized organic neural tissue within a 400-meter radius. Which was to say, couldn't think straight when one was close. That was the tactical problem. The closer you got, the harder it became to remember what you were doing there. The ninth had spent 2 years developing countermeasures, dampening rigs worn on the temples, cognitive anchors they called them, phrases and memories and physical sensations. You trained yourself to hold on to when the field started, eating the edges of your thoughts. Dara's anchor was her mother's sewing machine in the dark, the rattle of the bobbin, the smell of cut fabric. Jin's was something he'd never told her. She'd stopped asking. They went in through the northern approach, 6 on foot through the evacuation corridor, while the aerial units drew the harvester's attention from the east. The plan was simple: get close enough to deploy the resonance disruptors, devices that, if Sola's information was correct, might exploit the frequency vulnerability she'd described in the collective's neural override signal, and see if the harvester could be interrupted, rather than just destroyed. This was Jin's concession to Dara's theory. Unstated, practical, exactly the kind of thing he would do. "You don't have to tell me it was a good idea," she said over the comm as they moved through the corridor. "I wasn't going to," he said. "I know. That's why I'm telling you first." A pause. "Focus, Sergeant, always." The harvester was enormous, even prepared for it, even knowing the briefing numbers, the reality of it hanging over the bay with its wings spread, and the water below it gone dead and flat from the clot distortion field. The reality was something else. Something that hit the body before the brain caught up. Dara felt the cognitive anchor slip, just slightly, felt the edges of her thoughts go soft, and gripped the rattle of the bobbin, the smell of cut fabric, mother's hand on her forehead. "You're not sick. You're just awake." She held it. "Resonance disruptors on my mark," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was always slightly surprised by that. The field hit harder as they moved forward. To her left, Private Chen stumbled and caught himself on the wall. To her right, Specialist Adler was pressing his thumb to his palm in the repetitive gesture that meant his anchor was slipping. Trip reached over without looking and gripped his wrist for a moment. A second, no more, and felt him steady. That was the thing about the cognitive anchors. They worked better when you were holding someone else's. 30 meters. Jin said over the comm from the aerial unit. "I can see you. I've got eyes on the underbelly. When you deploy, it's going to react." "Understood. Dara, I know. I'm saying be careful. I'm saying it in the report style so it's on record." "Noted, warrant officer." Very professional. She heard very faintly, something that might have been a laugh suppressed mid-breath. It was the best thing she'd heard all day. "Mark," she said. 3 things happened simultaneously when the resonance disruptors fired. The first was that the harvester screamed with a voice. It had no structure for voice, but with the distortion field itself, spiked to 11 times its baseline intensity in a radius that bleached the color from the air, and dropped 2 members of the northern team to their knees. Dara stayed up through sheer stubborn refusal to go down, which was not courage so much as the specific bloody-mindedness that had gotten her through basic 4 combat tours and a relationship with Jin Reyes, who was categorically worth the stubbornness. The second was that something in the harvester's neural architecture flickered. She saw it, actually saw it, as a change in the distortion's quality. The field had been smooth and total and machine-precise, the way collective technology always was, optimized down to the last frequency, and then it wasn't. For approximately 3 seconds, it stuttered, chirred. Something underneath the override signaled, faintly and desperately, through the gap. The third was that Dara understood, in those 3 seconds, what Sola had been trying to tell her. The thing they could not reach. She didn't have time to think through all of it. That came later, in the debrief, coffee she didn't taste, and a whiteboard covered in her own handwriting that Jin photographed on his personal device because she had a habit of erasing things before anyone could transcribe them. What she had time for, in the field, was the gut-level operative version of the theory. The infection didn't take completely because some connections were too deep to sever cleanly. And the resonance disruption didn't just interfere with the collective's override signal. It amplified whatever was underneath. The original creature, the bonded self. Which meant, if you could sustain the disruption long enough, the harvester wasn't fighting them. The harvester was fighting the collective. "Change of plan," she said into the comm. "Don't engage. Hold positions. Keep the disruptors running and we wait. A pause. Jin's voice, that's... The plan assumed we were fighting the Harvester. We're not. The Harvester and the Collective are fighting each other inside the same body. A longer pause. Dara, 14 seconds of disruption got us that flicker. We have 4 disruptors. If we can get all 4 synchronized and sustain, you think. Jin, she stopped. Around her, the team had gone still, watching her the way they always watched her when she did this. The things that she did that she couldn't quite describe, where the logic and the instinct met in the middle, and she stopped calculating and just knew. Trust me. The longest pause yet. Synchronize on my mark, he said. And she heard in his voice the thing he always tried to put into report language. Fear that was only the shape of something deeper. The thing that made it matter. Keep your people clear of the primary emission zone. I'm adjusting altitude to extend the northern disruptor's range by 40 meters. Tell me when you're set. We're set. Then let's see if you're right. I'm right. I know, he said, Mark. The synchronized disruption lasted 94 seconds. Later, the scientists would call it a cascade event, which was accurate, but missed the part that Dara would remember for the rest of her life. Quality of the silence that followed. The Harvester came down slowly, not crashing, not destroyed. It descended, and the distortion field dropped, and the color came back to the air, and the water in the bay began to move again, with ordinary tidal indifference. The creature that landed, if you could call it that, if you could apply that word to something that had been between species for so long, made no sound. It was breathing. Its eyes, when they opened, were the deep, exhausted amber of something that had been fighting for a very long time. Private Chen, 22 years old, who kept a photograph of his grandmother in his left breast pocket, and had never in 4 years of service offered opinion on anything that wasn't directly solicited, took off his dampening rig and walked toward it. Chen, Dara said. I know, he said, which was apparently something her entire team had learned to say. He stopped about 3 meters from the creature's head and crouched down to its eye level and stayed there without moving. After a moment, the creature's breathing slowed. After another moment, it closed its eyes. Sola said, I told you. You told me there was something they couldn't reach. Yes. I didn't know what that meant until I saw it in the field. The original creature, fighting through the override. Dara sat on the floor of the corridor. She was still in her field kit. She hadn't changed yet. She wasn't entirely sure how she'd ended up here before the debrief had properly ended, except that she'd stood up at some point and walked, and this was where she'd stopped. Sola, the thing they couldn't reach. In you, in the Harvester. What is it? A long silence. I was someone's... Free, Sola said again. And they were mine. But what? You are asking me to name it. Another pause. Humans have many names for it. I have heard them in the communication signals. Love, bond, chosen relation. You have many words because you have so many forms of it. Because you give it freely and in all directions, and to things that cannot even speak your distinct names. A very long pause. The Collective has no word for it. Because they do not have the thing. They have function. They have purpose. They have the satisfaction of optimization. But the thing that makes a creature choose another creature for no reason, except that the other creature matters. They have never had it. They cannot model it. They cannot predict what something will do in order to keep it. She paused again. That is why the shaping fails sometimes. The bond is not in the architecture they can rewrite. It is deeper. It is in the oldest part. Dara sat with that for a long time. The ventilation cycled. Above them, boots on the corridor, someone running at the particular pace of a person who had just gotten news they didn't know how to hold yet. She heard Jin's voice, distant, on a comm she couldn't quite make out. If I can isolate what part of the neural substrate carries the bond, she said slowly, and develop the resonance disruption to target it specifically, not just to interfere with the override, but to amplify that signal. You would not need to destroy them, Sola said. You would need only to remind them. Dara stared at the ceiling. Remind them, she said. Yes, that they are someone's, that someone is theirs. The debrief lasted 3 hours. Mimi had the sensor data organized before anyone asked, which was standard. Harlan Voss had coffee ready, was unusual, and therefore touching. Jins was sitting at the back of the room when Dara came in, and he looked at her with the expression he wore when he was relieved, but trying to look like he'd never been anything other than calm. And she looked back with the expression she wore when she found this extremely transparent and also very dear. Command was represented by 2 officers who had not been in the field in some time and showed it, in the precise way of people who had learned to treat uncertainty as a tactical liability rather than a form of intelligence. They asked good questions and received uncomfortable answers with the air of men performing patience. Finding the one Dara spent 45 minutes defending, and that Mimi spent another 20 supporting with data that was, by any measure, extraordinary, was this: the resonance disruption, when synchronized and sustained, did not simply interfere with the collective's shaping signal. It amplified the underlying neural substrate of the infected creature. The original bond architecture. And in 3 documented cases over 94 seconds, the infected creature's own neural signal had overridden the collective's override. The infection had been beaten by something older than the infection. One of the command officers said, "Telling me the weapon is sentimentality." "I'm telling you," Dara said, "that the weapon is what the collective fundamentally cannot model." "Yes." A silence. "We would need to develop the synchronization protocol," the other officer said. "Miniaturize the disruptors. Extend the effective range." "Yes." "And Compact 1 Sola would need to remain available for ongoing consultation to help us calibrate the neural frequency signatures." "Yes, a beat." "She would also need to be moved out of quarantine. She's been cooperative. She's been more cooperative than most humans I've worked with, frankly." The first officer looked at her. "That's not standard protocol." "No, standard protocol hasn't worked in 4 years." Dara kept her voice flat and even. "She came back from the shaping because of a bond she chose. Asking her to help us replicate that effect at scale. The least we can do is treat her like the kind of entity who makes choices." Their silence. Longer. "Provisional approval," the first officer said. "You'll have 60 days to develop the protocol framework. Thank you." "Don't thank me. This is your theory, Sergeant. It either works or it doesn't." "It works," she said. Jin from the back of the room said nothing. She could feel, with the accuracy of 2 people who had spent a long time learning each other's frequencies, the exact shape of what he was holding. 60 days became 90. 90 became 140. Work was not linear and not clean and involved more failed calibration runs than Dara ever put in the official logs. There were several arguments with Jin that started about the protocol and ended about other things entirely, and at least 4 nights sitting on the floor of the corridor with her back against the glass and Sola's warmth on the other side, talking about things that had nothing to do with xenolinguistics or neural substrates. Sola's memory of being small and new and finding something that smelled warm and safe and wanting to stay close to it forever. Dara's memory of a sewing machine in the dark and a glass of water and a hand on her forehead. The specific texture of the things that formed you before you knew you were being formed. "You are all like this," Sola said, one night. "Humans. You carry the ones you have lost inside you and you use them to navigate. You are the only species I have encountered that does this." "I don't know if that's a strength," Dara said. "It is what you brought to the field," Sola said. "You reminded the harvester of what it was before. You gave it back to itself. What did you use?" Dara thought about it. "My mother. A sewing machine, the smell of fabric at midnight." "Yes," Sola said. "That is what they cannot shapen. The accumulated weight of who loved you. It is too specific, too individual. They cannot replicate it. They cannot model it. They do not understand why a creature would carry such things instead of optimizing them away." A pause. "I think sometimes they are afraid of it." "Collective? Afraid of humans? Afraid of the thing humans are made of." A very long pause. "They shaped me, and they found that thing inside me, and they could not cut it out. I think they did not entirely understand what they had found. I think. Another pause. I think you frighten them more than they have told you. First full-scale field test of the Resonance Bond Protocol, RBP in Command's shorthand, Dara privately called it the Remind, was conducted 163 days after the synchronized disruption over the bay. They deployed in 4 teams, 12 disruptors, miniaturized to the point where each operator could carry 2. Jin led the northern team. Dara led the eastern. Mimi, who had spent the better part of 60 days arguing with Command that intelligence analysts should be in the field for field tests of intelligence-derived protocols, led the western with a disruptor in each hand, and the particular expression of someone who was going to be exactly right about something and intended to make sure everyone knew it. The collective sent a distortion swarm that day. Not a single harvester, but 17 separate, shaped organisms of varied base biology, flooding 3 evacuation corridors and the eastern harbor. The standard response would have been artillery and air support, and a body count measured in personnel and munitions, that Command would report in numbers and Dara would count in names. Instead, the Remind. Later, Mimi would produce a data package that reduced the event to frequency charts and neural suppression curves and recovery trajectory models, and the charts were extraordinary, and the models were precise, and not one of them captured what it was actually like to stand in the eastern corridor and watch a shaped bear, 800 kilograms of collective optimized predator, burning blue-white with override signal, the kind of thing that killed 17 people in Stuttgart when Dara was still in her 2nd year. Stand still, just stand still. And then after a moment, make a sound that the dampening rig translated as nothing, that the neural monitor read as a bilateral limbic event of extraordinary intensity, that Dara recognized in her body before her brain caught up as grief and recognition, and something she did not have a clinical word for. It lay down, pressed its face against the corridor floor, and it lay down, and the blue-white light faded out of it, and it breathed. Private Chen, who was in her team, said nothing. He walked forward, crouched down, and put his hand on the animal's side. "It's okay," he said. It was not a strategic statement. It was not tactically meaningful. It was the most human thing she'd ever seen in a military operation. She would cite it in the official after-action report, under the heading, Observed Operator Behavior, Eastern Corridor, timestamp 0847, and she would be professionally precise about it, and not include the part where she had to breathe through her mouth for a moment to hold herself together. Sola was moved to a converted research room with a window. The window looked out over an interior courtyard where a maple tree had somehow survived the last 4 years, without being shaped, infected, weaponized, or administratively removed. It was, Dara thought, the most stubborn tree she'd ever seen, which made her feel warmly toward it. Sola sat at the window for long periods. She watched the tree. "What are you thinking about?" Dara asked one afternoon. "That it is still there." "For," Sola said. "Tree. It does not seem to know that it is remarkable for still being there. Most remarkable things don't." "No." A pause. "Dara, when the protocol is complete, when Command has what it needs, what happens to me?" Dara looked at her hands. This was the question she'd been not answering for 160 days. She'd kept not answering it because the honest answer involved a set of conversations with Command that she'd been having slowly and carefully, building a case brick by brick, and she hadn't been sure until recently whether the case was going to hold. "I've been negotiating your status," she said, "with Command. The argument is that you're a cooperating entity of significant strategic value, not a captive subject. Siri." "What does Command say?" "Command says the negotiation is ongoing." She paused. "What I say is that you're someone's, and you chose to be, and that means something. It should mean something even in the bureaucratic language of military protocol." She looked at Sola. "It's taking longer than I wanted, Siegs. You are still arguing." "Yes." "That is enough," Sola said. "Now, that is enough." The collective's response to the RBP came 40 days later. And it was the thing Dara had been afraid of since the beginning, adaptation. They began sending shaped organisms with deeper override architecture, longer shaping duration, seed. The infections that had been running for years rather than months, where the bond architecture had been worn down by sustained override pressure until there was almost nothing left to amplify. The remind still worked, but it took longer. And in the extended window, the shaped animals fought back. And there were casualties, and Dara read every name on the list and kept reading names until Jin came and found her at Iro 200 in the debrief room, staring at the list on the table. He sat down across from her. "We knew they'd adapt," he said. "Yes, the protocol is still working. The recovery rate is, I know the numbers." "Dara." She looked up. He looked back at her with the expression she'd first seen in the hallway outside Quarantine Bay 7, the one that meant he was about to say something honest. "The thing you're doing," he said slowly, "with the remind, what you're fighting with. It's not a military doctrine, it's not a weapon system, it's," he stopped, started again, "telling the collective that you're not going to kill what they've shaped, that you're going to bring it back instead. You understand what that means strategically? You understand the cost that implies?" "Yes, and you're still arguing for it." "Yes. Why?" Dara was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because the collective thinks we'll optimize. They think that once the costs get high enough, we'll calculate that it's more efficient to destroy than to recover. They think that's what any rational species does at a certain threshold." She looked at him. "They don't understand why we wouldn't. It doesn't fit in their model. The math doesn't work for them." She paused. "So yes, I'm still arguing for it, not because the math works. Because the math not working is the point." Jin sat with that for a long time. Long enough for the ventilation to cycle twice. Long enough for Dara to feel the particular stillness that meant he was resolving something internal. He said, "Okay, I'll put my name on the protocol extension request. You need a second signature for the command submission." A pause. "You were going to ask me, and I was going to say yes, and this is me skipping that whole conversation." Dara looked at him. "You've been thinking about this for a while. Since the Eastern Corridor. Since I saw Chen put his hand on that animal." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I'm a warrant officer, I calculate costs. And the cost of the alternative," he stopped. "No. Cost of losing what we are, in order to survive what we're fighting. I can't calculate that in a way that comes out right." Dara reached across the table and put her hand over his. Stayed there for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "Don't mention it ever. To anyone. I have a reputation." "Noted, warrant officer. Very professional." On the 204th day since Compact 1 had been brought in from the field, Sola pressed her face against the glass and watched the maple tree and said, without preamble, "I want to go outside." Dara looked at the tree. She thought about command. She thought about the protocol extension, which had been approved conditionally, pending ongoing cooperative status review. She thought about the word provisional and the word 60 days, and how neither of those had meant what command had intended them to mean. "All right," she said. "Sht. All right? It's an interior courtyard. The facility perimeter is monitored, and I'll be with you." She stood up, "And it's a good day. The tree looks well." They went out together, Dara and Sola, through the secondary access corridor and the maintenance door that she'd had rekeyed 3 weeks ago for exactly this possibility. The courtyard was small, maybe 20 meters by 15, and the maple stood in its northern corner, and the air was cold and sharp, with the specific smell of a city that was still here, still standing, still running its ordinary morning routines above and around the ongoing extraordinary work of survival. Sola stood in the open air and was very still. Then she made a sound. It was not grief. It was not the crying from the quarantine bay. Shh. It was something Dara had not heard from her before, and the translation framework, which had gotten considerably better over 200 days, rendered it as still here. "Still here," Dara agreed. Sola walked to the maple. She put one paw against the bark very gently and held it there. "It doesn't know it's remarkable," Dara said, "for still being there." "No." Sola said. "You do. You keep noticing. You keep holding the remarkable things, even when they do not know they are remarkable. A pause. That is also something they cannot shapen. Dara put her hand on the tree beside Sola's paw. Above them, through the narrow sky visible between the facility rooftops, a transport moved east. The maple's branches held their leaves, with the quiet stubbornness of something that had decided, without fuss, to simply continue. The collective was still out there. The distortion zones were still active over East Asia. The sensor array still mapped 17 ongoing incursion sites, and the adapted shaping protocols meant the next field deployment would be harder, then the last and the one after that harder still. None of that was finished. None of it was resolved. But here in the small courtyard, with the cold air and the tree and Sola's warmth beside her, here Dara felt something that she would not put in the after-action report, and would not in the protocol documentation, and would not cite in command submissions. She felt what the collective could not model, the thing in the oldest part, the thing that made the fear matter. She breathed it in, all of it. The cold and the tree bark and the weight of the days and the names she'd memorized. And Jin's second signature on the extension request, and her mother's sewing machine rattling in the dark. And she held it, the way she'd held the cognitive anchor in the field when the distortion tried to eat the edges of her thoughts. "Shh, you're not sick," she heard in a voice from a long time ago. "You're just awake." She was awake. They both were. And above the distortion fields, and the collective's incomprehension, and the long cold calculus of a war, fought with something the enemy couldn't compute. Somewhere in that, something was starting to understand that it had made a significant error. It had come for the ones who refused to stop. It had not understood what refusing meant. Not truly. It had modeled stubbornness as a form of inefficiency. It had not understood that stubbornness was not what humans called it when they were losing. Stubbornness was, humans called it, when they were reminding themselves why they were still here. The collective would adapt. The collective would send harder infections and longer shapings and more sophisticated overrides. The collective was very good at optimization, but it would keep finding, at the bottom of everything it tried to cut away, the same thing. The thing that made a creature press its face against the bark of a tree that didn't know it was remarkable. The thing that made a soldier put his hand on an animal that had been trying to kill him 30 seconds earlier. Thing that made two people stay up until 200, arguing about what kind of species they were going to be when this was over. The thing that the collective could not name, because naming something requires knowing what it is, and knowing what it is requires having had it, and having had it changes you in ways that cannot be undone. The collective had never had it. Humanity was made of nothing else. Dara kept her hand on the tree. Above them both, the sky held.